everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Glossy Philosophy. My name is Jansen Binman, and today you are tuned in for a book talk. Today we are talking all about Homer's The Odyssey. Now this is part two of two epic poems. The first one is the Iliad and the second one is the Odyssey. So I just wanted to talk about the author and kind of go into some things that perked my interest as I was reading, and also just kind of a plug for reading classics in general. So let's get started. First of all, if you have been following me and watching the book talks before, you know that this is a little bit of a different setup. I've definitely changed the setup several times this year, and I just want to say thank you for sticking in there with me. When I talk about books with friends and when I talk about books just in general, it's a little bit more of a just chit-chatty kind of vibe, and I felt like that was missing in the previous book talks, and I just wanted a little bit more of a let's grab our coffee, let's grab our tea, and let's have a great conversation about books atmosphere than what had previously been doing. So this is just a new vibe, and I'm hoping to continue this going forward. So let's get into the book. The reason why we are all here, if it's your first time, welcome. If you love books, I think you'll really enjoy the book talks. I do book talks every first Wednesday of the month, so let's get started. When I was researching Homer himself, or herself as the case may be, it was so interesting. I have seen his statue before in person, but the interesting thing is, and I got this from a very reputable source, I got it from a few different museums, especially the British Museum, who just recently, a few years ago, had a huge Homeric and Troy, Iliad, Odyssey showcase going on. So they really knew their stuff, or know their stuff. I was intrigued to learn that people still don't really know very much about Homer himself. So there is a Greek word that is Homero, which can mean captive. So we don't know if Homer was a free poet or if he was a captive from another land. We don't even know where he was born. And there is a leading researcher who thinks that Homer could actually have been a female. The other interesting thing about the idea of Homer is that maybe Homer wasn't one person. As soon as I read that, it really made me think about when I researched Shakespeare and Hamlet, and was he the only person, the only playwright writing all these amazing plays? And people feel the same way about Homer. They're not sure if he was, again, a captive or a free person, if he truly created all of these epic poems and stories, or if he gathered information from other bards, other musicians, and then just did a better job of creating these stories, or if it was actually a bunch of different people, because later on, after possibly Homer has passed away, there is a group of people who call themselves Homer's children, and they pass on these stories. So the other thing that you have to know about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and kind of moving away from Homer himself and getting into the story, is that these are epic poems. Now, they're not poems in a sense where everything is rhyming. In fact, nothing hardly ever rhymes. The important thing is it's almost like Shakespeare, where there is a cadence and there is movement in the language, but it is not a rhyming system. The other important thing to realize is that this is a story told by someone. There is no action going on. He or she is not narrating a play or anything like that. It's kind of like the radio, but the person on the radio is in front of you. So this could have been somebody on a street corner just kind of shouting out, almost like Rousseau did with his autobiography, or it could have also been in song, which is an extra fun layer when you think about it, because there is a really famous bard in the Odyssey who sings about Odysseus several times in the story. And so we don't know, kind of flipping back to Homer, if Homer was like, yeah, that's me, or if he or she was just kind of celebrating bards in general. So just one more thing, I know kind of jumping all over the place, but one more thing about Homer that I found really, really interesting was there's always been this kind of rumor about him that maybe he was blind. But when we kind of think about it and think about the reality of it, it doesn't necessarily make sense. He could absolutely have been blind if it is one person that we're speaking of, but that feels a little dramatic, a little theatrical, and it feels like it fits in with the two epic poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, the famous bard that sings about Odysseus in the Odyssey is also blind, so it just seems a little bit too on the nose. I was reading that perhaps it could have been almost like symbolic, like he is blind because he's not showcasing anything. Everything is coming from his mouth, and he is telling the story, and you as the viewer are not seeing this action happen in front of you. So let's get into the story and let's kind of dive in to some really interesting things. If you have not read the Odyssey, if you don't know anything about Odysseus or the Trojan War or Homer himself, you might want to stop watching this right now, because we're just going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about it like you know at least a little bit about something. And yes, there are going to be spoilers, so just so you know. Okay, let's do a quick synopsis. Odysseus has been missing for about 20 years from his home, and his wife, he's left a wife, and he left, at the time, he left a little baby to go fight a war over in Troy. So he fought for quite a few years, and then he's trying to make his way home. And that is the basis of the Odyssey. It is packed full of adventures, misadventures, lots of gods and goddesses kind of duking it out and fighting over this one particular guy and his fate. But it is really about Odysseus just trying to get home. Now, there are a few times when Odysseus kind of takes a break and hangs out with a goddess or two, and so you have to wonder, how hard is he really trying? But for the most part, I think he's trying pretty hard just to get home and back to his wife. They do seem to have this incredible connection, which shows up at the end of the book after most of the drama and action has happened. And they have a really lovely scene, which again reminds me of a Shakespeare scene in one of the Henrys, when Henry walks in and meets his future wife, who is French, and they're just kind of trying to communicate together. And that is kind of how the scene between Penelope, who is his wife, and Odysseus happens at the end of the book. It's really sweet. It's really funny, which is kind of a break away from all this intense drama that happens at the end of the book and has happened throughout. So it's a really great kind of finishing piece, especially because afterwards there's more drama. So it's, again, it's really, really lovely, really well done. It's also done in a very respectful manner. Obviously, their husband and wife, they are going to be together, but because we are talking about Greek plays and Greek drama, nothing is too grotesque, nothing is overt or just over the top. You have to use your imagination, you have to follow the line of the story in order to fill in the gaps, okay? So Penelope has stayed true to Odysseus this entire time, and she has brilliantly misled the suitors who have basically taken over her house and Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son, and they are destroying everything. And she is trying so hard because nobody knows anything about Odysseus. He's basically like disappeared from everyone's radar. No one can find him. No one's heard about him, especially within like the last 5 plus maybe 8 years. He's just missing. So is he alive? Is he not? Penelope is terrified because she loves Odysseus so much that she's going to make the wrong move, and she's going to marry someone and then find out that her husband is still alive. So I can't even imagine what that must have felt like if this is a real story. So she brilliantly concocts this thing with a loom where she weaves and then unweaves, and then someone finds out. Now, kind of diving into the character of Penelope, this is very similar if you've read Jane Austen, especially in her later works, when she's really trying to pinpoint what makes like the best type of English woman. That Penelope is like the best type of Greek woman. She is faithful. She is also strong, but she's like stereotypical female, just sobbing away so much, waiting for Odysseus to come. But most of all, she is faithful. And this is an interesting point because as Odysseus travels throughout the book and has all these adventures and misadventures, we find out that a lot of his comrades from the Trojan War have come home only to wind up being done away with in very brutal manners by their wives who have not been faithful. And even there's a part, spoiler alert, when Odysseus goes into the underworld and sees some of these women and hears some tales again of what has become of his comrades. And the unfaithful women are kind of shunned, whereas Penelope is like the woman that everybody would want. She's not too beautiful, she's super faithful, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so we have that whole thing going on. We have another layer where Telemachus, he was just a little baby when Odysseus left. He is now 20, possibly 21, and he is trying to take over. He is trying to become a man, but he doesn't know who he is. He's never met his father. He has no recollection of Odysseus. And it's interesting that within the first few pages of meeting Telemachus, he says to Athena, who he doesn't even know is Athena at that moment, but he says, I'm pretty sure Odysseus is my father, but I'm honestly not sure because I've never met him, so I don't know what he looks like. I don't know what his mannerisms are. And this guy is just, he's lost. He doesn't understand. He wants to know who he is, who he could become. He's royalty. It's really, really important. And yet he has kind of grown up in this bizarre world where he's never met his father, but people talk about him like he's almost godlike, and his house is just full of all these other men. So it must be very confusing. He eventually goes off and hears more wonderful stories about his father, and he starts to become connected to Odysseus in like almost a second person sort of way. And then when they finally meet, it is very sweet and it's amazing. Immediately Telemachus is just like, yes, you are my father. What can I do for you? How can I help restore you to the kingdom that you actually own? And again, spoiler alert, a really fun kind of connection to slightly modern world is in the sting between the two main characters. There's a moment when the big sting takes place and this nose thing happens. This is where it originates, is right here. Odysseus does that to Telemachus and instantly something major, major happens, which I won't completely spoil for you in this book talk in case you haven't read it. So we've talked about Penelope, we've talked about Telemachus. Now we need to talk about the gods a little bit, and we need to obviously talk about Odysseus. So the gods are very interesting. If you've read other Greek mythology, Roman mythology, you know that the gods are just like hanging out and they're involving themselves in human lives in very interesting and adult ways. A lot of the time they have sons and daughters, and they move wars, and they decide the fates of man. And it's interesting that there are two epic poems about basically the gods kind of moving the drama a little bit of what is happening to mankind. So it makes me wonder if this is supposed to kind of encourage mankind, or just say, you know, some things are you can't control and you have to give it up to the gods. Or it would just make me so frustrated if I was Greek back then, just thinking maybe I should just stay home all the time. But having the courage to live your life, if you were a true believer in the Greek way of life back then, to have the courage to live your life and try to do the best that you can, and always be worrying that maybe a god was going to approach you. There are several times in here where the characters are like, who are you? You have to prove yourself to me, because I'm worried that you're just a god who's messing with me. And of course Odysseus does run into this a few times, where he comes into contact with a god or goddess that doesn't want to help him but wants to hinder him. Sometimes it's his fault, and sometimes it's just because that's what they do. So that's kind of an interesting layer of, does mankind have control over their own lives, or is it just like anybody's guess and up to the whim of the gods at that particular moment? So Athena plays a huge role in this, and she also plays a huge role in the Iliad as well. Now, jumping to the character of Odysseus. So Odysseus, you know, before I read this, and I've read it twice now, I thought he was like the hero to end all heroes, because I had heard about the Cyclops, I'd heard about the Sirens, I'd heard about a few other of his adventures, and then reading it, I thought, well, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because this is from a long time ago, and you can't read a classic with modern eyes. You can, and that is kind of an interesting lens to read it through, but some things you have to just accept as this is the way that it was, and we're moving on. Or I'm so glad that I don't live back then, especially as a woman. So Odysseus he's godlike, and he almost is able to change and go in and out of mortal lands and immortal lands and hang out with the gods and goddesses just as if he were one. And he's constantly being treated and also just surrounded by them. So it's interesting, because in a lot of other stories, the gods and goddesses are very much like, no, you are a human and you are not allowed to be godlike, and if you try, then I will ruin you. And while he does have one of those gods kind of go after him, mostly because he hurts his son, he's really allowed to be godlike, just walking around, and Athena is always helping him as much as she can, or as much as she feels comfortable doing. So Odysseus is a very interesting character. He almost reminds me of Hamlet a little bit, where he gets to play the villain, the hero, and he never really quite plays the fool, only a little bit at the very end when he's in disguise and trying to figure out who has been faithful to him in his own household and who has not. But bringing up Hamlet, the Odyssey definitely reminds me of Hamlet. It also reminds me of many stories that have come after Hamlet. So just a plug for classics in general. I think it's really important to at least give them a shot. I will say that the first time I read this, it was really hard. It's been on my list of things I needed to read for a really long time, and I just couldn't get into it until about halfway through, and then the cadence started to make a little bit more sense. Odysseus started to make a little bit more sense. Honestly, it wasn't until he went into the underworld and I was like, oh my gosh, it's the first vampires, and it just got really interesting to me. The second time reading it, which I did right before I did this book talk, I felt so much more interested in these characters in a different way, and I was able to let go a lot of that modern lens that I was reading it through the first time. I had a professor a while ago when I was going to school to be a teacher that said you have to read things twice to truly understand them. And I think that is very true, especially when you're reading older literature. You have to read it twice. Once so you can just kind of, figure out the big picture and understand what's going on. And then the second time you get to pick up a lot of the detail and really get to dive in and think about, why is this being written? Who is Odysseus supposed to be? And just, the characters of Penelope and Telemachus and Athena and all of those things. So you should definitely give it a try if you've never tried before. And if you have tried and it didn't work out, try again. Pick it up again, because there's a lot of influence from the Odyssey that has been spread out into modern literature. If you've read Ernest Hemingway, I swear it is the same cadence. There's a lot of repeated phrases and words in his writing, and there's a lot of repeated words and phrasing in the Odyssey. It's interesting because Ernest Hemingway, it's a book. It's not being audibly spoken. It's not a play. It's not a poem. And yet there's so much repetition. You almost feel like he must have really liked Homer, because it's so similar. Shakespeare for sure. So those two are really jumping out at me, only because I've recently read them and kind of dove into those two authors. But a lot of the stories, there's paintings and other artworks and all of that is just, it's all from here, The Sting, and you should absolutely give it a chance, even if it upsets you with some of the female nuances and things that happen. Try not to read it through a modern lens. Try to take it as the epic poem that it is, and, skip parts that are upsetting to you if you need to. So that is the book talk. Thank you guys so much for watching this book talk and traveling to the ancient Greek times with me through the Odyssey and Homer. I hope you enjoyed a little bit more information about who the author might have been and a little bit of a deep dive into the story. Of course, I have my blog with a little bit more information or different information, and some things will be linked below if you're interested in kind of following up on this story. But again, I would highly recommend it, and definitely give it at least 2 reads before you decide yay or nay. So thank you again for watching. Normally I do fashion videos every Wednesday, beauty videos every Friday, and on Mondays doing specific events and tackling specific questions to make your life a little bit easier and a little bit more glossy. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!